double-jointed, written by Danzida. Tester Mylan wasn't a man who really appreciated the beauty of nature. He never understood hiking in the woods or vacation into tropical locations. A tree was a tree, a sunset was a sunset, and bugs were icky. Maybe all his enthusiasm for nature was killed by living in the city. After all, it was called the concrete jungle for a reason. The only animals in its ecosystem were the flying rats, crawling rats, and domesticated pets who probably fed on rats. Not to mention all the people-sized rats as well. Enon was particularly rat-focused because he swore up and down he saw the little fuckers in his home. It's been a while since he had a genuine surplus of food in his home, and he never was the most cleanliness of house dwellers. So, for a brief time, he got to enjoy a long stint of not having to worry about rodents trying to eat what he had rightfully claimed as his. Alas, that time had come to an end. And so, Enon found himself outdoors in a quaint little town of Ponyville, attempting to ignore the nature around him as he always had. But the shit was everywhere. It made it especially hard to look for the home of one named Fluttershy. During one of Spike's visits, Enon recalled him saying that the yellow horse had a way of talking to animals. Enon hoped he could use the whole friendship thing to cash in a favor and get her to run them out of his house. The less said about Enon's many attempts to get rid of them, the better. Clang. Enon heard the distant sound of metal hitting against an object. Easily swayed by his curiosity, Enon followed the sound. Every once in a while he would hear the sound again, voices growing more audible the closer he got. He found himself on Applejack's Sweet Apple Acres. Upon further investigation, he found two mayors, Applejack and Rainbow Dash, playing a game of horseshoes behind the barn house. It was both interesting and fitting how the game of horseshoes had cross-dimensional appeal. Enon watched the mayors from the barn house, not quite behind them but more at an angle. He learned his lesson from last time. "Ha, that's another point for me," Rainbow Dash said, having tossed her horseshoe a few inches to the stake. "That puts me in the lead." Ready to give up? Enon rolled his eyes. He still couldn't get over the incessant need of the pony to win everything. Maybe it was simply because he always figured the only true way to win any game was to never play, as any conclusion could be drawn from speculation. You nail 100% of the shots you don't take, theoretically. "Don't at me." "Now you wait just a sec," Applejack protested, a horseshoe in her mouth. Enon hopes they wash those things. It ain't over till it's over. "In fact, I bet you 2 bits I can get a ringer with this here toss." Rainbow grinned the prospect of winning some money. "You on?" With that, Applejack grinned herself, craning her neck downwards for the toss. Enon questioned how she would be able to hit her target if she had to risk obscuring her vision just to toss it. Isn't she essentially just throwing it blind? Regardless, Applejack's neck snapped back as she let the horseshoe fly. Sure enough, it was a dead ringer, catching itself on the stake and giving a few spins, before settling down. "Aw, come on," Rainbow Dash shouted, as Applejack laughed with pride. Rainbow Dash flew into the air, somehow hovering upside down as she threw her head back, her head in her hooves. When she opened her eyes, she could see Enon leaning by the barn door, watching them. Enon. Her earlier frustration had left as quickly as it came. Applejack also turned to see the unintentional stalker. "What are you doing here?" Enon flinched, as though he was suddenly caught in headlights. "Me?" he asked dumbly. "Oh, I was just walking by and saw you guys doing something. I swear I only just got here." Real convincing, anonymous. Despite the trench Enon was adamant on ticking, the mayor's just kinda shrugged, assuming it was Enon being anonymous. "Well, since you are here, did y'all want to join in?" Applejack asks, pointing to the horseshoes. Enon contemplated this. On the one hand, he wasn't very coordinated, despite all the video games he played. He could easily make a fool of himself and bring shame to his entire race. On the other hand, these ponies were disadvantaged, simply by their anatomy. The offer was tempting, but Enon had his pride to maintain. "No, you ponies can go on ahead." Enon dismisses the idea with a wave of his hand. "I'm content just watching from over here." "Aw, is Enon getting cold hooves?" Rainbow teased with a smug grin. Enon went into glare mode. 1. I don't have hooves, I have hands. Enon corrected. 2. I just simply don't want to play. Given my physiology, I may just end up winning every round. Ugh, you sound like an egghead. Rainbow rolled her eyes. "And what makes you think you'd win every round?" "Well," Enon began walking over to the mares and their setup. He picked up a horseshoe. "I've noticed that you ponies use your mouths to toss these and to bend your heads downward in order to snap back up to launch the horseshoe in the air vertically. With that method, you aren't actively measuring the distance of your toss, as your line of sight is shifting. You're just launching it and learning from trial and error whether you threw it too hard or not enough." Enon eyed the stake and held his vision steady, swinging the hooves in his hand. The ponies looked on with interest. With my arm doing the swinging, I can use my head to focus mainly on precision, gauging the distance, while arm feels the weight of the horseshoe. Then, Enon tossed the horseshoe lightly. He didn't land ringer, but he get pretty damn close. A hint of pride illuminated his smile. That was a lot of fancy talk, Anonymous Applejack said, skeptically. Yeah, well, all you need to know is that I can do that more consistently than you girls. Enon dusted his hands and prepared to head back to the barn, when Rainbow Dash cut him off. Are you implying that you're better than us at our own game? Rainbow accused. No. Well, where we come from, this was our game. Your ponies were incapable of separates. But, I'm not particularly better than you in games. For example, if we were in a race, you'd beat me by virtue of your forelegs and wings. Despite my stride advantage, Enon brought up both of his hands and wiggled his finger for emphasis. But in any game where I can use my arms and hands, I got you fuckers beat. Enon gave his own smug grin to the Rainbow Horse, causing Al to silently fume. Your arms, huh? Applejack put a hoop to her chin, before coming to an epiphany. Why don't we have a little hoop wrestling contest then? You may have the claws, fingers, Enon corrected. You've guys seen minotaurs before, how do you not know what fingers are? Whatever. Anyway, you may have fingers, but we ponies, earth ponies especially, are reputed for our strength. And to let her pride show, posing to show her leg muscles. Enon had to admit, she sure looked strong. Yet, he enjoyed knocking these horses down the peg. Well, hoof wrestling isn't strictly about strength though, Enon argued. It's also an understanding of physics, and why don't you save the explanation and just prove it already? Applejack smirked, now getting Enon to fume. The three silently agreed to the competition as AJ led them all to a picnic table. Enon sat at one end and AJ sat on the other, much to Rainbow's displeasure. I'll go first, since I suggested it. You ready, Enon? She set her elbow weight, ponies had elbows, of her elbow equivalent, on the table. Enon placed his on the table as well and grabbed her hoof. It was a strange feeling. Holding AJ's hoof, he could feel a joint that he could only assume was like a wrist. It became clear that these ponies, despite being ponies, had a weird anatomy that allowed them to imitate human anatomy. For example, simply by placing this elbow on the table, Enon could see a shoulder, which had previously not been there. Enon made a mental note to stop by Twilight's castle. She is apparently the best source for information in this town, and it did him good to actually learn this stuff before writing checks his ass may not be able to cash. Regardless, he had educated himself on arm wrestling strategy in high school, just for the fun of it. Rainbow flew at the other end of the table, raising a hoop in the air. The moment it came down to signal the start of the match, both AJ and Enon began to push. Enon nearly lost outright, the pony's strength nearly overwhelming with how sudden it was. Rainbow Dash laughed as Enon struggled to push against the workhorse, who herself was having a chuckle. Human strength will not be of any help here, so it was time for Enon to show them how humans became the apex predator. Enon shifted his hand higher on AJ's hoof, so that she would lose some of that strength as she pushed on Enon's lower palm. Then, he pulled AJ's hoof toward himself, hooking our hoof in between his wrist. Suddenly, Enon managed to push back against AJ, causing both the mares to grow quiet. Soon, they were back to the starting position. Enon cracked a knowing grin to AJ, before turning his whole body into the push and pushing his elbow out at the same time. Then came a resounding thud as Enon pushed the horse's hoof to the table, declaring his victory. The jaws of the two ponies dropped as Enon withdrew his arm and tauntingly flexed his fingers. I done told you all. It ain't all about strength, Enon boasted, failing to practice his humility. Talk and strategy are equally as important. No way. You cheated. Rainbow protested. All of what I did is completely legal where I'm from. I didn't lift my elbow, I didn't use my other hand, I merely manipulated my arm in the best way to move against her. Oh yeah? I'll be the judge of that. Rainbow bumps AJ out of her seat and places her hoop down with a determined slam. While AJ sighed, Enon took position again and the match was on once more. Enon switched up tactics this time. Instead of going for the kill, he merely held out as Rainbow pushed as hard as she could. It was certainly difficult, but she wasn't nearly as strong as AJ was and she was quickly exhausting herself. Soon, little by little, her assault waned and Enon was able to push Rainbow to the brink of defeat. Rainbow gave one last push, but it was no use. Enon began chuckling, then cackling, before he bellowed into full and evil laughter. He slammed Rainbow's hoof onto the table. That's 2-0, baby. Enon said, getting louder and cockier. What say you, Lemba? Want to go for a three-peat? Rainbow grinned her teeth and growled. For 30 minutes, Enon did battle with Dash and Jack. The two switched off regularly, each trying to develop their own counters to Enon's tried and true strategies. That succeeded, as Enon won again and again. With each win, his ego became more inflated and he began to insist on more matches. "Don't bitch out on me now, Skittles," Anon shouted, after another glorious victory. "I'm just getting warmed up. I can do this all day." Rainbow yelled in frustration, unable to comprehend how Anon was winning so much. They tried to do what he was going, but then Anon simply waited for them to tire, given they had already burned themselves out. "Come on," Applejack pleaded with Rainbow, who was having none of it. "Anon's got this one in the bag, I reckon. You can just beat him at any other game, but I want to beat him at this one." Rainbow whined like an indignant child. She looked back at Anon, who rested his arms behind his head. "One more round. Winner takes all." "Take all of what? We didn't bet anything. We had, you all would be broke." Anon made a show of checking his nails. "Whatever. I want one more shot. I know I can beat you." Anon could see that Rainbow could not accept defeat. She had to be broken. Broken so thoroughly that she would never make the mistake of challenging him again. "Fine. Another match you shall receive." Anon complied in a sinister tone. "Because I am benevolent, I'll even give you a handicap." Anon placed an arm on the table, but this time, his left arm. "I'm proficient with my right hand. My left, not so much. Although, it should hardly matter. I'll win again and again." Once more the two competitors rattled limbs and stared at one another with extreme intensity. Applejack shook her head, mumbling about regretting ever bringing up hoop wrestling. She took her position and raised her hoop in the air. "You all ready?" AJ asked, amused. "I'll show you why they made me a Wonderbolt," asserted Rainbow Dash. "I am the rock on the eternal shores. Crash against me and be broken," taunted Anonymous. AJ's hoop fell, signaling the beginning of the end. The same song and dance occurred, with Anon using all his tricks to secure another victory. However, it was considerably harder, as he's never used his left arm for wrestling. His body wasn't quite lined up right and his arm felt weaker by comparison, but he wouldn't back down now. He wouldn't be shown up by some Technicolor pony in a Technicolor wonderland. He will introduce to him the harshness of human nature. He will show her man's propensity for wanton destruction and humiliation. He will show her mankind's true face. Rainbow wouldn't allow Anon another victory. She had lost too many times to this ape and she would not allow it again. She faced off against Mandicarus, Budbris, and even Cerberus himself. She fought the likes of Nightmare Moon and Queen Chrysalis. She was present when Equestria was ravaged by the Everfray, Tauric, Sembra and even an ancient shadow creature. She was an element of harmony, the element of loyalty. There was nothing she can't do, no obstacle she couldn't crush, and no pony she couldn't beat. She will show him Rainbow Danger Dash. The two were locked in eternal combat, sweat forming on their brows. This was the hardest both of them had pushed themselves thus far. The table groaned from how much they squeezed against it, their combined weight threatening to snap the table in two. Rainbow Dash's wings began to flutter, faster and faster, until they flagged as hard an engine, edging Anon closer and closer to the table. Anon's eyes widened as he saw that his arm was failing him. He gripped his teeth, used his other arm to grab hold of the table and gave his left the hardest push that he could muster. Snap. All went silent. Not a word was spoken, not a breath taken. Rainbow had held her eyes shut, so she opened them. What she saw caused her jaw to drop. There it was, Anon's arm resting flat on the table. Slowly, Rainbow's expression grew from one of shock to one of awe, as her smile from ear to ear. "Yes!" Rainbow Dash yelled to the sky, chasing her voice as she did loop-de-loops and rolls. She hooted and hollered and sang as she celebrated her victory. This went on for a moment before she flew right back to Anonymous in your face. "I told you I could beat you. What do you have to say to that?" Anon had nothing to say. Anon was silent. Deathly silent. His eyes remained glued at his hand, still resting against the table. Dash was confused. There was a look of disbelief, but something was off. Rainbow looked to Applejack, for maybe she had a clue, but all she saw was Applejack looking at Anon's arm with pupils the size of pinpricks. Rainbow, too, looked at his hand more closely. When her eyes followed up Anon's arm, it soon became clear what everyone was really staring at. Anon's upper arm, specifically the humerus bone, had completely fractured. His arm bent, forming an irregular shape. Anon looked on, eyes still wide, but his mouth forming neither a smile nor a grimace. All of his expressions laid within his eyes. This silence held for another moment, a painfully long moment. After a while, Anon took a deep breath and stood up, carefully nursing his broken arm. "Ladies," he spoke, softly and without fear nor pain. "While I am still in shock, could either of you please direct me to the nearest hospital? I'm afraid I may have fucked up. It has been 3 days since the hoop wrestling competition." Rainbow and AJ were playing another game of horseshoes. Enon stood nearby, his arm in a cast, leaning on a nearby fence post. It was lucky that Ponyville did indeed have a hospital, a curiously advanced one at that. They had equipment to view x-rays of his humerus and found that it was merely a proximal humerus fracture, the best case scenario as far as bone fractures go. Enon had to have his bone shifted back into place and given time to heal. This was a rather stressful procedure as it became clear that equestrian medicine doesn't work quite the same on human biology. Needless to say, the pain will stick with Enon for as long as he lives. However, the worst of it was over and he could go back to watching ponies do their pony things. Rainbow landed a ringer. Nice shot, Rainbow. Applejack congratulates her friend. Guess that means you won this time. Applejack's praise was genuine, but Rainbow didn't cheer or fly around in circles. Instead, she gave a shy smile and rubbed the back of her neck. Heh, yeah. Guess I did, huh? Rainbow didn't sound so sure of herself. She casted a look towards Enon, who was doodling on his cast for the hell of it. She sighed and flew over to him. When he looked up, he was met with the depressed gaze of a flying blue equine. Hey, Anonymous. Dash started, not looking Enon in the eyes. I just wanted to, apologize for breaking your arm. I got carried away and I should have. Enon blew Rainbow Dash on the nose with his free hand, disorienting a Pegasus. Look, you ponies might like to ramble on about what you're sorry for, but you can just say sorry. Enon explained. He removed his hand and began ruffling her already messy mane. I fucked up too. I let my pride and ego get the best of me and dragged you down the same road. Rainbow swatted at Enon's embarrassed about his affectionate gesture. Quit it. Rainbow Dash ordered, blushing. What are you doing? It's called petting and I find it puts you equestrians in your place. Enon stopped again and wiggled his fingers once more. That's the magic of hands. Applejack trotted over as Rainbow glared. I'm glad you all made up and stopped acting like children, Applejack said, with her sagely wisdom. Keep in mind, you suggested the whole thing, AJ. Enon pointed out with Rainbow nodding. You're just as responsible and guilty. AJ craned her head toward the barn. What's that? It sounds like Granny Smith needs help baking some apple fritters. The orange began to retreat to the house. If y'all want some, I suggest you hush your mouths and come with me. She gave the two a wink and they all shared a chuckle. Together, they walked to the cozy apple residence. You know, Skittles. Once my arm heals, you might be interested in learning about a little game called King of the Hill. Rainbow looked up at Enon with renewed interest and a look that screamed game on. Applejack could only plan to hoop to her face.